But on behalf of Howard, who's the director of our leadership project, and myself, Jeff DeBelko, I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program, it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome all of you to the Wilson Center to hear what will be, I am certain, a very interesting presentation with a long title, but one that really, I think, gives you a sense of all the thought that's gone into the process that Monty and Jack have put together. It's called Global Report on Conflict, Democracy, and State Fragility 2007, Gauging System Performance and Fragility in the Globalization Era. I am reminded to thank Jack already. Jack has been doing a lot of service here at the Wilson Center. I see some familiar faces who saw him make a presentation here this last week on demography and conflict. He's a multi-talented person. As I think many of you know, Jack is the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Professor at George Mason School of Public Policy and a senior research scholar at the Mercatus Institute. Jack's been a longtime friend of the Wilson Center, and so we're thrilled that he's here. And Monty Marshall is also someone who has come and both spoken and participated over the years at the Wilson Center, so we're thrilled that he is here as well. Monty is a senior research associate at the Center for International Development and Conflict Management, or I should say was. Now is at George Mason. We need to get ourselves up to date here. But made the migration across the Great Potomac over to George Mason and has joined Jack there as well. And really somebody like Jack who really has their arms wrapped around the state of conflict and trends in the world today. And so we're thrilled that the two of them are here to share some of their new work. We're also quite pleased that Michael Lund, the consulting program manager to the Project on Leadership and senior specialist for conflict and peace building at Management Systems International, someone who knows these topics far better than I, is going to be in the chair today. And so we thank him very much for his time here. I see many familiar faces, but just allow me to say a word about where we're sitting. The Woodrow Wilson Center is a former memorial to Wilson, founded in '68 by Congress as a place where the worlds of scholars and practitioners and policymakers could come together and have an exchange, something that I think the work that Jack and Monty have put together really will be something that services that and bridges that divide that's often there, but when the material is presented in a certain fashion that is policy friendly can really make a difference. And so we're thrilled to be hearing about their work today. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Michael, and thank you all for braving the snow and coming out to join us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Well, this does promise to be a very exciting session. Many of you know the history of international concern and interest in conflicts and more recently fragile states quite well, but what we've seen is a mushrooming of research on the causes of conflict, creating all kinds of databases that are quite readily accessible on the internet on the numbers of conflicts. CIPRI and other organizations have been tracking that for some years. USAID and other development agencies have commissioned people to go out and assess the potential for conflict in particular countries in order to formulate development strategies, because development agencies have really taken up the cause of conflict in a big way ever since the middle 90s. And this has stimulated an awful lot of activity in particularly vulnerable countries by NGOs, humanitarian relief, development, as well as diplomats to try to respond to the causes of conflict as they emerge. But since 9/11, the new theme, related but not exactly the same thing, in policy circles is fragile or failed states. And of course, this was occasioned by the perception that terrorism is often finds breeding grounds in these ungoverned areas of states or are largely ungoverned states. And so they have become seen as a threat to international peace and security, and are also now on the agenda of many development agencies as well as foreign ministries and defense ministries. So what we have here today to talk about is a new and somewhat more comprehensive framework for analyzing state fragility that incorporates variables having to do with conflict, development, as well as governance. And I'll leave a further explanation to our presenters today, but they happen to be among the small group of best analysts in terms of the use of quantitative and comparative data of conflict and development trends globally in the world, sincerely. So I was going to give introductions of each of them, but Jeffrey basically did that, and you have more information about their backgrounds on the bio sheets. So I'll just turn it over to Monty first, Monty Marshall, who will speak for about 15 minutes first, and then Jack Goldstone, and then we'll open it up for questions. So thank you very much for introducing this to us.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to stand up because I can't remember what I put on these slides. So I need to see it in front of me. I got to push you through the world and everything that's important about it and everything we need to know in 15 minutes. So I'm sorry for the whirlwind tour, but I think we've distilled it down to the point where perhaps there's some hope that I can push you through in 15 minutes. We'll see. A little background. Because we live in the United States is politically active, shall we say, and engaged in almost every country in the world. We decided that we needed to have some way to gauge performance in the global system. If we're going to have a globalization era and closer relations among states within this global system, then we need to be able to maintain a good grip on what's happening in the system, what our prospects are, where we're headed. And this is one way to look at it. This comes on quite a background. Global and system regional societal systems analysis. It has precedents. The Third World War, a book that I wrote that studied the global system during the Cold War, Peace and Conflict, which I co-created with Ted Gurr at the University of Maryland, where we gauged the global system biennially in this report series. But a lot of what we know about the world and what we think is important about the world, Jack and I, both members of the Political Instability Task Force, and that's been going since 1994. And we've also been working with USAID on the State Fragility Initiative for several years. And this State Fragility Index is the culmination of the effort that we have put in there over the last, 4 years now, Jack? What we're trying to do is gauge system performance using key trends and risk factors and measuring state capacity. The alternative to state capacity, weak state capacity, which we would be determining fragility. We look at 162 countries in the world, that is all countries with population greater than 500,000. And Jack will describe the details of the State Fragility Index and Matrix. Right now it's a baseline in 2007. We're talking about reestablishing the baseline at 2000. But the main focus of this presentation is on the post-Cold War situation, the globalization, what we call the globalization era. And this is slated to be an annual report that will be published in the Foreign Policy Bulletin and is available now, apparently. And so in gauging system performance, we're looking at three main aspects: governance, conflict, and development. Development has two dimensions, the material and the human capital development. In previous research, what I found astounding was we're all familiar with the weakness of Africa, but in doing a systematic search, we found out that Muslim countries are every bit as weak and fragile as African countries. And this just astounded me because of the media attention that it gets and our main association of Muslim countries with major oil reserves. So looking at the global trends, some of you may be familiar with this work, that during the Cold War, which is to the left of this solid black or dotted black line, this vertical line, we had a fairly high level of interstate conflict, but manageable. The yellow or the orange is intrastate conflict. Most of the war during this Cold War period was civil warfare, and it accumulated over time and increased linearly over this period of time, and to a peak that reached in 1991-92. And it's fallen off since then by 60%, which is very, very encouraging. What's discouraging is this measure of high casualty terrorist bombings. These are bombings that are targeting non-combatant populations in which the kill count for any single event is 15 people or more. This is what we really fear about global terrorism. And you can see that since the 2001 attacks on the U.S., there has been mainly a linear increase in the number of deaths by these high casualty terrorist bombings. And the last 6 months, these are 6-month periods before and after 2001, and the center line again is 2001, and the death count for that single attack, 2,982. But you'll see that the most recent 6-month period, which is not quite over, it's still got 4 days left, has really skyrocketed. But almost all of these events are happening in Iraq, and they have spread to other areas in the Middle East and South Asia, but they're mainly confined there. The rest of the world has experienced about a doubling of the deaths by these types of events, still very low, around 200 people per year in the rest of the world. Governance, good news here. With decolonization during the Cold War, many new countries came on as autocracies, which is the red line. With the end of the Cold War, or even predating the end of the Cold War, we see a scissor effect where autocracies start to disappear, and we have the third wave of democratization. We have a jump, mainly with the independence of the former Soviet republics and the socialist client states of Eastern Europe. The black line is our line of concern. These are what we call anocracies. They have mixed authority characteristics. They're not really democracies. They're not really autocracies. They're transitory. They are inherently incoherent authority, inherently unstable. And we've seen an enormous jump of those in the post-Cold War era. The high risk of developing instability. The good news is that something is keeping them from lapsing into instability for the most part. And we've had several people speculate on what that might be. International engagement, of course, is extremely important. The end of the Cold War probably has the greatest explanatory power, as the superpower rivalry is no longer driving conflicts within these states. Systemic development. Well, we'll use the United States as the best example of system development, right? We have 50 states. They're comparable in size to many countries in the world. Tightly integrated, have been for 200 years. And what's the outcome? Well, all of the units approximate each other in their contribution of income to the system. The distribution of income, this is a Lorentz curve of income distribution amongst units. Almost perfect equality among the states in the United States. This is a good measure of system integration. Look at Europe. We also have a very tight Lorentz curve. That's the two curves that are approximating the diagonal, which is perfect equality. The dotted line is 1992. The solid line is 2005. And you're seeing improvement, and these are the core states of Western Europe, the original states that made up the European community. The other dotted line that sags a bit shows the expansion of the EU and is mainly determined by what would happen if Turkey was brought into the EU, and largely explains why there's the issue of Turkey's ascension is causing dissension within the European Union, because it really creates a lot of differences amongst the units as to their perspectives and their prospects. South America, which has experienced very little armed conflict, has a fairly good profile and an enormous improvement in distribution of income This is offset by the fact that income in South America in general has fallen off the global pace, that they've actually lost income compared to the rest of the world, and the income gap for South America is widening in the globalization period. Give you some idea of the conflict and democracy in South America. Very low conflict, and most of the states are democracies at this point. Asian profile. This does not include Japan, Australia, or New Zealand. If they were included, Japan overwhelms the mainland. So this looks at the mainland, mainly mainland Asia, and you see some improvement mainly because of China's dramatic improvement. But still quite a bit of inequality, not well integrated. And as evidence of their lack of integration, we see middling levels of armed conflict throughout the period and mixed regimes. A lot of autocracies remaining in Asia, some increase in democracies, but still quite a mixture of regimes. Sub-Saharan Africa, which we usually think of as the weakest region, and these are all the Sub-Saharan African countries that do not have a Muslim majority. Very, very poorly integrated, and has actually gotten worse in the globalization period, and compared to the rest of the world, the income gap is growing. They're actually doing worse compared to the rest of the world. And to look at their conflict profile, they're the poorest region. They have, again, middling levels of armed conflict that have dropped off only in the last couple of years through enormous international efforts. But the regime on the right, almost all autocracies in the new states coming out of the colonial period, they've almost all disappeared, but democracy is slow getting a grip in African countries. We're seeing mainly what we call anocratic states, a lot of one-party dominant states, but again, even though they don't have the classic undergirdings for democracy, they are holding together, but at least in the short term. Here's the Muslim countries. They are also getting worse. It's also a very bad distribution of income amongst units. And what reinforces these maldistributions of income amongst states in these regions is that there's almost no interregional trade. There's almost no interregional investment of profits from primary commodity production into manufacturing sectors. So the manufacturers in the Middle East and Africa are at a very low level as a percentage of exports, usually less than 10%, as is interregional trade. Less than 10% of the trade is interregional. Yes, and I'm almost there, so I'm right on track. And here, the Muslim countries, as we have a gut feeling, the armed conflict is much higher than any other region of the world. It's dropped off dramatically in the post-Cold War era, but it's started to level off in the last few years. And this is the one area that is diverging from the general trend. This leveling off, we're seeing a lot of outbreaks of low-level conflicts in the Muslim countries that could easily escalate. And so this is a cause for great concern. Attendant to that experience with armed conflict, you see that many countries in the Muslim countries are still autocratic. Most of the remainder are the incoherent regimes, and very, very few democracies. The democracies are mainly on the periphery of the Muslim region, and the autocracies are almost invariably oil-producing states.
Can you clarify, what is Mauritania, Sudan, Chad? Are they Muslim countries?
Yes, they are.
So the SSA isn't Sub-Saharan Africa?
It is sub-Saharan, but it isn't through the middle of the Sahara. It's at the bottom of the Sahara. And that's really the only difference between the classic conception of Sub-Saharan Africa and this one. This is the global profile then. This is the income distribution of all states in the world system. It's a model of almost perfect inequality. What we found in research is the poor countries have a tendency to experience low-tech armed conflict, very brutal violence. We see that in situations where there's a lot of rich countries and a lot of poor countries, the distribution of redistribution of income is usually through charity, which really doesn't cure the problems that drive poor countries to experience armed conflict. It actually serves more to drive it because it's support coming from the outside, and it actually augments their ability to follow their own lead rather than to adopt new practices and develop capabilities to pursue alternative policies. And so it actually increases their ability to make war beyond what they would be inclined to do. And so I'll turn it over. I think I'm pretty much on schedule. Thank you very much for keeping me on track. And
what slides do we have up there for the matrix?
There's like 4 slides. It just goes through the basic pieces.
Okay. Too helpful.
Hopefully it'll look familiar to you.
Yes, right. If not, we'll work out of this. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for coming despite the weather. Let me say a little bit more about the framing of the journal and where you can find this report. The trends that Monty has documented are described in more detail and with more data in the report itself. Now, the report is a feature of this journal, Foreign Policy Bulletin. Now, many of you may not be familiar with this, although it's been around a long time. It started out as the State Department Bulletin and was where the State Department published official foreign policy statements of the Secretary of State and the President. It was then moved out of the State Department and taken over by the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, where they continued to publish the same basic material. Now, last year, the journal moved from SAIS to George Mason University, and we've tried to keep the best of these features, but we're adding more. That is, the journal still is the journal of record, publishing the major speeches, declarations, strategy statements of the White House, and not only the State Department, but other cabinet offices that make important foreign policy statements. And their interviews with President Bush and other heads of state when they touch on key issues. The value of the Foreign Policy Bulletin is that while these things appear scattered on the web and then disappear after a while, the bulletin edits them, puts them in order by subject. So if you want to look at all of the U.S. State Department official statements on Iraq for the first half of last year, you can go to the bulletin and find them. And the bulletin is now searchable and on the web. In addition, we will be publishing the annual report, and starting in the fall issue, we will be publishing review articles that examine the consequences of U.S. foreign policy and essentially make an assessment how well have results turned out in terms of meeting the objectives that had been stated by U.S. foreign policy officials in the previous year. So we'll print people's objectives and goals as the official statements, and then we'll see how things follow, in fact, in the following year. Now, I have left discount subscription forms on the table outside. I really do encourage you to pick them up because we think this will be an important journal for tracking U.S. foreign policy and increasingly for tracking the condition of the world. If you simply wish to obtain the global report, it is available for a modest sum, $15, on the website. And that's a 20-page report that gives you all the data that Monty has presented and more, and then gives you the fragility matrix that I'm going to present. You have to go to the website to obtain that. Just go to www.foreignpolicybulletin.com, and you'll find opportunities there to look at the report and also to enter a hard copy or online only individual or institutional subscription. Get your employers to make this available to you if you don't have it for yourself. All right. That said, why did we develop yet another set of indicators for the conditions in countries? Frankly, Monty and I have been involved in a variety of metrics research programs undertaken by a variety of organizations. And of course, we've watched with interest as foreign policy has put out its index of failed states. The World Bank has put out its governance scale. Now, with so much out there, why do we need one more? Well, this scale was designed with very particular objectives in mind. The existing scales that try and give a picture of the condition of a country have a lot of drawbacks. For example, the Freedom House and polity scales focus on the conditions of governance and civil liberties. And although they're very useful and very good at distinguishing the full democracies and the full autocracies, regimes in the middle are much harder to describe in scale. We find, in fact, that between Freedom House and polity, there's a rather low degree of correlation in classifying some of the countries in the middle range, and they're particularly uncertain in tracking small movements over time. So in other words, if you are in the business of trying to develop policy to improve conditions in fragile states, most of which are in that kind of middle area between hard autocracies and full democracies, those existing Freedom House and polity scales are at their weakest and least helpful in precisely that range where you're most often called upon to intervene. The World Bank's state capacity and governance scale has recently been subject to some very serious attack. The Journal of Politics last December had an article. Melissa Thomas of SAIS has work in progress assessing that. And the problem with that scale, although it was put together with intelligence and good intention by Art Cray and others at the World Bank, is that it, I think, leaned too far in its effort to be comprehensive. It threw together as many plausible indicators as they could find of state capacity, and therefore does a lot of mixing up of apples and oranges. It's not very clear when there's a change in that index, what exactly is going on? How do you bring about a change? What is that scale consistent with? Does it intuitively respond to anything that we're familiar with? And most of the critiques have pointed out that there is a great deal of lack of fit, as it were, between the items that the scale most plausibly wants to measure and the year-to-year variation in the scale itself. The same thing is true to somewhat degree of the Foreign Policy magazine Failed States Index. That index, again, throws together a lot of different indicators, and some of those indicators rely on subjective scores. That is, like the Freedom House indicators, they ask experts to say, how would you rank countries in regard to this condition? Now, my friend and co-author on a project, Philip Tetlock, who's a distinguished political psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, brought out a book last year that looked very carefully at how good is expert judgment in politics and a number of other fields. And he found, to a lot of people's surprise, that if you poll experts and then rigorously subject expert opinion to after-the-fact testing, expert opinion really is not very good as a predictor or forecaster of events in countries where people are considered experts. I mean, one of the reasons that there's been a flurry of interest in objective scales is, after all, because so many of our analytic experts missed the coming revolution against the Shah in Iran. They missed the collapse of the Soviet Union. They missed the global expansion of the war on terror and the degree to which al-Qaeda scaled up. So expert opinion tends to suffer from two things. One, experts talk to each other a great deal. So expert opinion tends to converge to the mean of the expert group. And the second is that experts tend to project from recent experience. That is, there's a lot of extrapolation in the way experts make their decisions. So if the world is changing, or if what you really need is a careful examination of evidence that departs from current expert opinion, you're just not going to get that from expert polling. So we wanted to develop a scale that was very transparent, that is, all the components are easily found in open source material, and that would not be dependent on these kinds of expert subjective judgments. Now, we also wanted a scale that would be of particular value for the pressing policy problem of helping to strengthen weak and fragile states. Now that means we weren't concerned with getting a single number that was the most accurate predictor of what's going to happen next year. Frankly, the factors that are most predictive of whether or not a country is going to have a major conflict next year is its level of income and whether it has had a conflict within the last year or last 5 years. Neither of those are things that most policy agencies can do anything about. It's very hard to lift a country's income appreciably in a short period of time, and of course past history weighs us down no matter what we do. So we tried to look more comprehensively at the range of factors that people have argued are important in understanding whether or not citizens and elites are liable to remain loyal to a state if there is a crisis. In other words, what makes a political system resilient, loyal, hang together, versus what conditions open fissures. And so we looked at 4 dimensions. We wanted to look at a state's performance in regard to security, politics, the economy, and delivery of social services. And for each of those dimensions, we wanted to look at 2 sides. We wanted to look at how effective the state is in achieving certain goals or targets, and what we like to call legitimacy that we operationalize in terms of breadth and distribution. To what degree is the state inclusive or discriminatory, broadly based or narrowly based in its actions in the political sphere, economic sphere, social service sphere? We have called this the politics, economic, social service, security, and social service framework with effectiveness and legitimacy dimensions. So the acronym, you need an acronym in Washington, so that's the PESEL framework. Now, the way this matrix is assembled is we develop scores for each of the dimensions, and we have added them up. We have not weighted them. There's some argument to be made that security perhaps should be weighted first, but we haven't undertaken that. A next stage in the research will be to try and examine different weightings and see if different weightings of the factors have different degrees of predictive value for particular outcomes. What we were concerned with, however, for this project is, can we develop a plausible baseline? And this is the 2007 table. It deals with the latest data going up through either 2005 or 2006, according to what's available. And on this baseline, can we reasonably rank states according to these dimensions using objective data, and can we provide plausible scores? And the nice thing about doing so is because it's all out there in the open, one can easily see if a state looks highly fragile, where's that fragility coming from? Does a state have problems with regard to effectiveness or legitimacy? That is the state weak in terms of resources, or is it weak mainly because it's highly discriminatory or repressive? So that manages to jump out. Now, we have highlighted 4 factors in the table that are not part of the index per se, but rather are the kind of common sense indicators of these conditions that people look at. Is there an armed conflict going on? Is the country democracy, an autocracy, or intermediate type? Is it a net oil producer consumer? And is it an African country, Sub-Saharan Africa, or is it a Muslim country? We highlight all of those things because we were curious to see how well does our scale relate to these kind of common sense indicators of what are the issues in a country. Now, what indicators did we actually use? Here's the kind of the nuts and bolts of the recipe. For security effectiveness, we looked at how much violence there has been in a substantial period. We actually looked at a 25-year period and looked at the number of casualties or degree of armed conflict on that.
Oh, we used the magnitude measure and the residual factor over the
It's basically a time-weighted measure of armed conflict over the last 25 years. So if there was a small conflict a long time ago, that is scaled down to have little or no effect. However, if it's a small conflict in the last 2 years, it still has an effect. A very large conflict, however, even scaling down over time, still has a residual effect. So the details of the computation of this residual war variable are in the table. But the idea is, how much war has this country had looking backward? And the bigger the wars were and the more recent they were, the higher this value. For the legitimacy aspect of security, we look at the political terror scales from Amnesty International. Sorry. Now, for political effectiveness, we look at several aspects of regime stability. We ask, how long has the regime been in power? If it's more than 10 years under the same government, that's a positive. However, if the same individual leader has been in power more than 12 years, we find that leaders that are getting a bit long in the tooth tend to invite challenges. And so that's a negative. And we add these up. Sorry, the clicker obviously is not hooked up here, so we have to stick with the numbers. For political legitimacy, we look at a number of measures of how exclusive the government is. Is the government dominated by a single ethnic group? Is the electorate broadly inclusive or restricted and narrow? Is there factionalism among the different groups contending for political power? For economic effectiveness, we look at income. This is income per capita, and ask, is a country in the top 20% of the world's income, second quintile, third quintile, and so on? For economic legitimacy, that's a hard one. We don't really have a great deal of confidence in national income distribution data, Gini coefficients, and such. They're not widely available for all countries, and the data's not good. So what we have found, and this draws a little bit on arguments from Paul Collier and others at the World Bank, and Terry Carl and Michael Ross, countries that get most of their income from a source of rent that is controlled by the state, oil revenues, mineral revenues in a diamond or copper country, where the government basically is a rentier state and independent of the broader economy, the state tends to go off and do its own thing without requiring much popular support. On the other hand, where most of the exports come from the manufacturing sector, you tend to have a significant business and labor community, and there needs to be some type of balance relationship, recognition of law between the state and the manufacturing sector if that's going to be a substantial export sector. So we looked at the share of export trade in manufacturing goods, and the higher that is, the greater score we give for economic legitimacy. And not surprisingly, most of the countries that have low scores on legitimacy are net oil producers. Finally, for social effectiveness and social legitimacy, we look at basic measures of human well-being. For social effectiveness, we use the UN Human Development Index. And then for social legitimacy, we try and ask, all right, how well is the state doing in taking care of its people, especially considering the level of income and resources that the state has? So the social legitimacy indicator is in part simply the measure of infant mortality relative to world norms. Then that is adjusted to see whether infant mortality is higher or lower than you would expect from a country's GDP per capita. As most of you know, there's a strong relationship in general between infant mortality and income, even though infant mortality is a broad population measure of well-being, whereas income per capita measures kind of the total global net income produced by a country and then just divides by the population. So if a country's income goes mainly to a small elite group, you can still have a moderately high income per capita, but the poverty of the bulk of the population shows up as higher infant mortality than you would expect for that income level. Conversely, if income is very broadly distributed and public services are in good repair, you will most likely get a lower level of income of infant mortality than would be the norm for a country with that overall level of income. So this is how we look at the what we call human capital care provided by a country. So for each of these 8 items, we give a score from 1 to 3, and then we add them all up. And what I really wish we could do is blow up the top half of this scale. So I'm going to have to walk you through it, because right now it just looks like a checkerboard gone mad or a neon sign, right? What we have here in red are the higher scores, both for the total fragility score and for each of the components. Now, I think what's most interesting is to simply go through some of the countries. And again, this entire report is available online, either free with a subscription to the journal or a separate purchase. The countries that come out as most fragile by our index are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Chad, Myanmar, Burma, maybe a bit of a surprise I'll come back to in a minute, and Sudan. No real surprises there, although 4 of those 7 countries are Muslim, 2 are in Africa, 1, Myanmar, is in Southeast Asia. And you might say, well, isn't Myanmar a hard dictatorship? Don't we tend to think of those regimes as fairly stable? And yes, in terms of the durability of the political system, you might say that. But when we look more comprehensively, Myanmar has been bogged down in a series of wars on its border that show no sign of letting up. The regime has been highly repressive, numerous human rights violations. The economic performance has generally been terrible. Great deal of violence occurring day to day, largely associated with the border war, but also to some degree with drugs. So, and of course, the democracy movement was suppressed not all that long ago. So, is it a nasty regime? Yes, and in fact, it is both a particularly nasty and particularly economically and socially ineffective one. So we think that just looking at the nastiness of the military dictatorship leads you to overlook some of the other flaws and weaknesses in the country. Now you might say, what about North Korea? Isn't that the same? And North Korea, because it's a one-party state, shows up overall fragility index score of 7, as opposed to overall score of 20 for Myanmar. And you say, well, why isn't it worse? Well, it is pretty bad in some respects, but there's a lot more kind of equality of suffering, as it were, in North Korea. North Korea, although it has a dominant party state, doesn't have the same kind of ongoing ethnic wars on its border that Myanmar struggles with. It's not the same kind of ethnically exclusive regime that Burma has constructed. So we think there are substantial differences. Other countries that show up at high risk, Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Liberia, Nigeria, again you see the African theme here, Angola, Guinea, Iraq being one of the more unstable states in the world by our measure, fragility index of 18 out of a possible 24, in the kind of tied for 5th among the groups that are doing badly in terms of their risk. Rwanda, Guinea-Bissau, Nepal, Niger, and so on. I'm happy to answer questions about specific countries, but I think I've taken up plenty of time. I should turn it over to Michael and our audience.
All right, thank you very much. All right, we have quite a bit of time for questions, and if that flags a little bit, we can turn back to the speakers for more. So let me take down note you those of you who have questions. We'll collect a few and then go from there. Okay. Yes, sir.
There's so much in here, and it's...
Oh, can you introduce yourself?
Yes,
please?
Leonard Oberlander.
Your affiliation, if you have one?
I'm Board of Trustees of People to People International. And my views, since I said that, are my own, and I'm not representing
I'm
the
going to
organization.
China with People to People International in May, so thanks.
There's so much data in here, and it's been factored, factor analyzed, and weighted, and so forth, and some of it by expert opinion. And it's all been. But okay, here this is leading to my question. If it's not organized by expert opinion, but I'm wondering about cause and effect. I'm making this general. I'm wondering about cause and effect and what you can say about some of the factors, some of the variables, their weights, and how they cause and affect each other. And I noted some things that I had in mind that weren't mentioned as factors. One is education, which is possible when you have society, a stable society. That may be part of cause and effect. Another is that money can come from development or the legitimate economy, and not just from the government. I think you were alluding to Russia with the petroleum and gas exports, but also from criminal organized gangs that can take control of resources where the government isn't strong. And income, again, from developed income from developed resources and income from undeveloped resources, such as in Kosovo, where there are mines that are valuable and are sought after, but are undeveloped. And I'm not framing this question specifically. I can leave it at that. These were. Is it sufficient? Did I define it sufficiently to?
You put a lot of problems
answer?
up there for us to answer. Yes.
Any other questions? All right, let's collect a few. Yes, please.
Since I'm right next door, it makes it very convenient. My name is Ann Phillips. I'm at the Department of State now. Personal question, not State Department question. Since you've been working on this question, looking at data from the Cold War period to the post-Cold War period, do you find that in this era, new era of globalization, that certain variables are much more important now, or is there a kind of continuum? Has the absence of a global architecture or international architecture affected the salience of different variables?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Kevin Ummel with the Center for Global Development. I'm wondering, one, on the scaling issue, I notice you have 1 through 3 for each of the 8. That's how you arrive at the 24. I'm wondering how you assign 1 through 3. Also, my feeling is with any exercise like this, it's relatively easy to isolate the countries at the bottom, the most fragile. Once you get to the middle of the pack, it becomes more difficult. So I'm wondering, within your 8 indicators, what's the distribution looking like? Are they clumping at the bottom, or are you seeing a relatively smooth distribution throughout that's telling us something about all the countries? Thank you.
All right. Ruth Buckley, please.
Hi, I'm Ruth Buckley. I'm with USAID. I think I've seen various earlier versions of this, and this is great. I'm very, very impressed. And I'm really, really pleased that you've managed to sort out making sure that the data is just totally objective on one level. I know it's almost impossible. But I think my question is given the preponderance of problems to be in African Muslim countries, what does this tell us about what we should actually be doing in those countries in order to reduce fragility? And is there any way we can actually link this kind of an index to actual interventions? And is there any way to test or over time figure out whether those interventions are actually having the desired outcomes?
Okay, why don't you field those 4 before we go on, or 4 plus, however you want to do it.
Should we go back and forth? You want to start?
Okay, I can go first if you like, or you can go first. That's fine.
If I go first, I won't stop, so why don't you go first?
Well, it's assuming that I will.
I'll stop you if I have
Okay. Well, you have the authority to do that. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of very rich questions, and of course, there's a lot of detail in the report. We can't possibly go over to every detail. The question of salience, though, I think is very important. It's something that we've struggled with. Now, in general comment, the indicators that were chosen were, on the one hand, chosen because they were transparent, but mainly they were chosen because they have been shown in multiple analyses, because we have been engaged in quantitative analysis of these problems in various definitions for many, many years. And the same indicators keep propping up as being the primary risk factors. And so we tried to focus the matrix on what we know are the primary risk factors. Now, there is a whole basket of factors that we could have included that are very tightly related, which is what your question was. And what we found from the research is that having more does not give us more information. That through research, we can identify key indicators that really summarize all of the information that would be contained in having a wide range of indicators. So we can present a matrix that is fairly simple to look at and to comprehend, but really is representative of a wide range of indicators. Now, if you want to get into the detail, of course, these show you the weaknesses, and you can look at the related indicators and see how they're performing in that particular issue area. But this, I think, gives a very authentic and very accurate depiction of the strengths and weaknesses. As far as the salience, post-Cold War to the Cold War period, what we found in our models is that the risk factors remain fairly constant across those two periods. What's intervening is something that's dampening the risk. The length of time from the appearance of the risk factor to the lapse into instability. Something is dampening the process. We would like to think it's international engagement. We would like to think it's a change in ideology and expectations, that people are not as quick to pull the trigger. There is, one of the main factors that I've discovered is the attitude of the military and the professionalization of the military, which is a program that is susceptible to policy intervention, has been extremely important. And in situations that have reached crisis, the decision by the military not to intervene and to repress the opposition is absolutely crucial to preventing a lapse into instability. And the way we define instability, which is a regression to a more autocratic rule or an outbreak of armed conflict. Instead, we're seeing executives who are not performing well, cannot get the backing of the military, and they're resigning office and giving the executive leadership over to someone who may have a policy that may be able to pull the country out of its morass. The point that I want to address, the policy implications for the problem regions, Africa and the Muslim countries. We'd like to assume that South Africa and Asia are on the right track, and if they just stay on an even keel, they can regulate themselves and correct themselves. It's really outside shocks and interventions that are likely to throw them off track. And I was giving a presentation to the National Security Council in Taiwan, and they were questioning why the U.S. changed its policy. And I said, well, we're starting to see mainland China and Asia in particular as being on track, and we don't want you to rock the boat. So think about it. And let's just see where this goes, because it seems to be going in a positive direction, and we have great hopes for that situation. But as far as the Muslim countries in Africa is quite clearly just needs assistance in developing capacity, broadly conceived, in dampening the propensity to lapse into violence when they don't have ways of making a living. Getting a control over what's now the problem, which is organized crime, which is also always attendant to situations that are post-conflict. You have armed people with violent skills who are no longer engaged in armed combat, are now using those skill sets in criminal activity. And that's probably the biggest problem in Africa right now, is getting control of organized crime. But in the Muslim countries, and this is the toughest one to swallow, because we're all oil consumers. All the oil consumers are the least fragile states. All the oil producers are the most fragile states for the most part, or the middle fragile states. There is extreme pressure on oil producers right now. And all the autocracies almost gone from the system. But oil producers, extremely autocratic, have to maintain an extreme grip, not only to maintain control of those resources and the wealth that it produces, but also to resist pressure from external trade and demand from consumers. Democracy just has trouble working under that kind of tension and pressure. So we can't expect much democratization in those situations. How do you get the Muslim countries straight? Well, I would suggest a global energy policy that takes a little bit of pressure off the oil producers, a lot of encouragement of the oil producers to reinvest their money in their own region, to give jobs to these people, to create industries, to create markets, interregional trade. I mean, this is the big thing in the Muslim countries. Of course, it also is important in Africa. But for the Muslim countries, they've already made the next step from Africa. They have twice the income of Africa. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's not half, but it is quite a distinct geographical dividing line. And so, yeah, there's a little confusion in the way we usually conceive of it. But, you know, in the current salience, Islam has become such a immobilizing factor. And it is the one factor that seems to have that greatest anti-globalization content and the greatest potential for supporting an armed conflict against globalization forces. So we need to be very sensitive to that. But I don't see great prospects for the consuming countries to come together. I mean, we can't even come up with a way to govern emissions, let alone consumption. But that's where it's going to have to be, or we can expect a lot more problems in the Muslim world.
Well, to go back through these, and I think your question about, what do we do? Well, one of the things that this scale helps highlight is the very different nature of the problems between, say, oil-producing countries that are reasonably okay in terms of their economy, if you look at overall levels of economic activity and growth, but are not diversified, tend to still be very concentrated in their wealth, often have very discriminatory and sometimes repressive regimes. A lot of the African countries, Sub-Saharan African and non-oil Middle East and South Asian countries, really do have a broad range of capacity problems. They're not good at delivering economic growth. They're not good at delivering social services. You asked about education. Education is a component of the Human Development Index. Literacy is in there in one of our social dimensions. But they tend to have broader difficulties in multiple dimensions with poor effectiveness. And the really dangerous ones have both poor effectiveness and poor legitimacy because they are not only bad performers, they also tend to have regimes that survive despite bad performance, largely through coercive means. And coercion is powerful in the short run, but fragile in the long run, because if you fail to sustain coercion, your enemies take advantage and you have disorder, coups, or other difficulty. Someone asked about overall trends. Well, what we see is countries that cluster at the upper levels of the fragility scale have a broad variety of problems. They tend to have poor effectiveness and poor legitimacy on multiple dimensions. As you get down to the middle range of the scale, you see more variation. Some countries in the middle are reasonably effective, but score very poor on legitimacy. That is, they don't distribute well, or they're discriminatory or not inclusive regimes. Other countries in the middle range are more open and equal, but have terrible
scores on delivery. Haiti, for example, scores really badly on all dimensions of effectiveness, but is not quite so bad with regard to legitimacy measures, again, because the misery is broadly shared, and the government, although incompetent and presiding over a terrible economy, doesn't practice the kind of ethnic exclusion and the degree of systemic discrimination against portions of its population that you find in some of the countries that have really severe political cleavages that coincide with ethnic or religious divisions. And then toward the bottom end of the scale, you see basically the good performers, countries that score high, that do well, have good scores, which are low scores in this context, on both effectiveness and legitimacy. It's certainly true that these indicators, we can't cover everything that would certainly be of interest. We don't have an indicator for small arms sales, for example. We don't have indicators for drug smuggling or human trafficking activity. Nonetheless, as Monty said, those problems tend to be worse precisely where you have states that are presiding over weak or limited economies, or where there's already a lot of violence or repression that limit the capacity of the population. So we don't think that leaving those out really undermines our results. Rather, we think if we had those things for every country in the world, they would actually show up to be pretty much in line with these other factors that we've found to be consistently good indicators of conditions.
There was a hand in the back there. Yes, sir.
Stay Poach with the Voice of America. I would like to know about Cambodia, in specifically in the your what you call fragility charge. Where does Cambodia stand? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Back in the mid 1990s, when I was in the National Intelligence Council, we did an exercise called the failed state exercise, which started to look at some of these same questions. In fact, Jack Goldstone was very helpful to us at that time, along with many other academics. This clearly represents a very useful refinement of what we started then, and although it identifies many of the same countries at the low end, it does it with probably considerably more confidence and is very helpful in terms of going further up towards the middle than we did. There's a question I have. You identified, as did the failed state study, infant mortality as one of the key strong indicators. The other indicator which is missing from here that I wanted to ask about was the openness of the economy, which we measured, I think, with using exports, imports, and we found that that was a very strong indicator, and it seems to have dropped out here, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
All right, Chip Walker.
Yeah, I have Chip Walker from USA. I have two questions. One of them is actually to re-ask a question that was asked before, which is how do you actually score these on the 1, 2, 3 scale for each one? And the second question I have is, do you have any insight on the sensitivity of the scores? In other words, year on year, are there some of these variables that you would expect to move? So a country would be expected to move up and down, or is it sort of more or less fixed in place?
All right. Yes, sir.
Well, my name is Marian Zulan. I'm a Fulbright scholar. I have two questions. One, it's about methodology. It seems to me that you used national indicators. Did you also use the transnational? You talk about globalization. Did you find some transnational indicators in your metrics? And the second, it's about solutions. Do you see any role for the military in the global governance, or you focus also on the national militaries?
All right, yeah, maybe we should stop there. That's about 4.
And some of them are coming back from ones we didn't answer before. We didn't really cover the Cold War. We didn't cover the 1 to 3, and so on. On the Cold War, one of the things that seems to be a clear difference is the countries that are neither, I mean, Mani mentioned this, neither full democracies nor full dictatorships are lasting longer than we would have expected. this may be in part because of precisely the kind of global intervention. The hypothesis of the Human Security Group at British Columbia has been that UN interventions have been helpful in stopping wars or preventing unstable situations from deteriorating further. This may be a temporary thing, it may be a long-term trend. It's a little too soon to tell. Some of the things we thought were over, like the PKK in Turkey and the Tamil civil war in Sri Lanka, have reopened again. But it certainly, two things happened with the end of the Cold War. One was the United States and Soviet Union withdrew their support from a number of unstable regimes that they were propping up for geopolitical reasons. So that in Liberia and Zaire and Afghanistan, regimes that were getting external support in Cambodia, the U.S. basically said, okay. Soviet Union said, okay, we don't care, and those regimes fell and initiated periods of conflict that are only now kind of burning themselves out. The other thing that has happened since the Cold War is the opportunities for global participation in the global economy and the informal pressures on global elites to kind of adopt regimes that look better, or kind of manage their problems, or soften their repression. And this apparently has led to a learning process where a number of leaders have learned how to manage regimes that have some limited openings for popular participation, but are still restricted enough to keep leaders in power. And they seem to be managing this better. Now, as far as the 1 to 3 scaling, there's no mystery there. The report details in the notes how do we translate each of these measures, such as is income per capita in the top quintile or middle quintile or bottom quintile, into a 0, 1, 2, 3 scale. How do we translate things? Some of these scales are like, we have a discrimination scale from the Minority at Risk Project. We have a ethnic leadership coding from Political Instability Task Force data. We have a Amnesty International terror scale. How do we translate those scales into a 0 to 3? We basically simply say, if it's in this range, it's a 0. If it's in this range, it's a 1. If it's this range. So all of that is completely transparent and should be reproducible by anyone who has the data and simply looks at the notes and gets the coding rules.
A question was about trade openness. We were struggling with that with the task force for years and years and years as to what it meant and how to explain it. Fortunately for us, it dropped out of our models. It had a volatile quality in that it combines confounding factors in that, trade is a good thing, but it depends on the factor makeup of the trade. And we weren't able to come up with a way to qualify the trade openness as to good trade openness and bad trade openness. And so, as we've pointed out, oil trade can be very bad for a country as far as creating a cadre of political elites who capture the state and pretty much block the rest of the population out of participation. And Collier and Hoffler have detailed other commodity factors. And so taking that into mind, trade openness is just a very confused measure that we didn't want to pull into this because we don't understand it. But we do bring in trade. Interregional trade is extremely important in mollifying or pacifying or leading countries to not undermine the stability of their neighboring countries, to not engage in arms trades or providing refuge for armed factions. And so encouraging that is extremely important. So that's our trade factor. The military role, is there an international military role? Let me put that off for a minute. Two things that I want to point out to further clarify the situation is that in looking at the onset of armed conflict, what hasn't changed is the rate of onset. We have a fairly constant rate of onset from during the Cold War period through the globalization period. Conflicts do break out, and they do break out at a fairly constant rate. It's about 3 or 4 per year. What is different is the likelihood that they're going to escalate into very serious armed conflicts. Whatever is happening, international engagement is going in and dampening these so that they don't accumulate over time and they don't escalate as quickly. The other factor of global engagement is in regime, the quality of governance, is that unlike the onset, we don't know exactly how many countries are going to lapse into political instability situation, but what's happening is that countries are less likely to lapse back into autocracy. They're more likely to adapt to some kind of open governance and maintain it over time. And I've mentioned one of these mechanisms, the professionalization of the military, which doesn't intervene and repress the opposition. So you get situations like Zimbabwe on the bottom end, where you have constant factionalism, which we're now finding is the main problem of democratization. But it's managed informally in that they disagree and they fight about it and they argue about it, but they don't come to blows about it. It's ruining their economy, and they're going to have to wise up sooner or later. Other situations, they actually institutionalize it, such as Malaysia and Singapore, which have factionalism, but they've learned to accommodate it. And Lebanon, which has been doing it for quite a long time, but have this major failure and has a large external component, which may explain that failure. Countries are learning how to manage their factionalism. So there are different ways of governance that we weren't aware of that seem to work over the long term. We're in highly divided or with a lot of multiple ethnic groups with competing claims or competing interests. They can actually operate in an open system. But it takes a different institutional arrangement, and these countries need to learn how to manage their affairs. And we have situations of managed instability, like Pakistan, where it should have failed numerous times. It only failed once in 1999. It's now starting to experience some armed conflict. But it's been Bangladesh, a better example, has managed its instability since independence. It only has one minor outbreak of a serious armed conflict. But there is something going on, and there is a learning curve. It's a very steep one, apparently. But we are seeing signs of real outcomes from policy interventions. But these are the two main areas, dampening armed conflicts that have onset, and preventing catastrophic regime change into brutal autocratic regimes.
Let me reply to the question about Cambodia, because it's an illuminating example. Cambodia shows up with a score of 14 out of 24. It's a middling country in terms of fragility. Its legitimacy scores, however, are very good. Legitimacy score is 4 out of the potential 12. It's the effectiveness score that's 10 out of potential 12 that is pushing it higher in our fragility rankings, and that comes mainly from 2 factors. One, bad economic performance recently, and a fair bit of political instability in terms of turnover of leaders. Last year, though, Cambodia started to look like it was getting on an economic growth path that was more promising and developing Sihanoukville, tourism is improving. So if they can keep the government in a stable framework of succession, and if the economy can get a few years of steady growth, they can greatly improve their score in our measures. Now, let me emphasize that this score is not designed to measure vulnerability to near-term instability of certain kinds. For example, ranking countries on this scale is not going to give you a rank order of which country is most likely to have a military coup next year. Okay, that is a political problem, and by and large, countries in the upper half of this group are much more likely to have a military coup than countries in the bottom half. But What this chart is designed overall is to look at general political and economic development. And the problem that USAID and State Department and military have set themselves overall is, how do we help countries that are authoritarian, repressive, and poor progress to be more open, fair, and prosperous societies? And the problem with most of the indicators that people have put forth as metrics for countries like Iraq or Afghanistan or global governance is they don't really look at the whole scale of this problem. They focus on one piece or another, or they omit pieces. I remember Paul Wolfowitz trying to explain the progress we were making in Iraq in terms of social service delivery, looking at, yes, people are being killed, but that's a side issue because we're building schools, we're building roads, and we're providing opportunities. I think he had part of that right, but you can't leave out the security element and focus only on the economic good that's being done. And what this matrix tries to do is say, okay, let's try and look reasonably and equally at all of these elements that people in the development community care about and are trying to improve, and see if we can track them fairly straightforwardly in one picture where the parts are fairly clear and we know the parts individually relate to things that matter. That is, we know that on the economic side, the Human Development Index, infant mortality matters. We know that on the political side, factionism and discrimination matter. So let's put them together and create what we hope is going to be a useful working tool.
I think that answered your question, Chip, but if not, raise your hand again. Okay. I believe this gentleman was in before the next group.
Thank you. Severin Rugumamos, Woodrow Wilson Center. I just wanted to find from you the value added of your work to the World Bank studies by Collier. And my concern here is methodological. There is always a tendency of having a unit of analysis as a nation and forgetting about the region and the global system. And particularly when you're talking about countries at the margins of the global economy. And Colliers' work looks at interventions at the national level and forgets about the global system within which these small countries work and operate. And that makes the work ability to explain and intervention to resolve rather than managing the conflict a problem. And my question is your unit of analysis remains a nation and you don't go beyond that? And what is your ability to explain and ability to predict? Thank you.
And there was a subnational question earlier, too.
Right. We have generally found when we do subnational analysis,
or region.
Region I think is a multinational area in the world. A region sometimes is a part of a country, but we're using it differently here. When we do subnational analysis, we find the same factors tend to be important. It's not a different constellation of factors. If we want to look at India as a cluster of separate states and say which states have the greatest problems, it's the same states within India that do worst on human development indicators, discrimination, instability of the government. Same things show up. So we think the factors make sense. This is a national, the unit is the nation state embedded in a region, is the way I would put it. That is, yes, we give scores for Pakistan. We don't give scores for Waziristan within Pakistan. We have to deal with aggregation to the national level because that's the level at which political interventions are generally targeted, and that's the level at which data is generally collected. But we look at the regional setting. Are these countries in Africa? Are they Muslim countries? What corresponds with that? What's their position in the world economy? Are they oil exporters? Are they oil importers? What is the nature of their trade? Is it primarily manufacturing, or is it primarily mineral dependent? So you're right, there's a weakness. We don't analyze at the subnational level per se, but we don't think that the causal framework would be radically different if we did. Monty?
Yeah, I mean, there is a subnational component, and of course, if there are constituent ethnic groups occupying certain regions, this is factored into the matrix. If there is differential relations between the state and certain ethnic groups, it's going to show up on the which one is it? It must be the political legitimacy.
Political legitimacy.
Scale. From the other end, this is the value added for this is the only one of the several measures that are available now that actually has approaches this from a systems perspective, looking at the global system mainly, but regional subsystems, and how the different state units operate within their regional system, and how you can compare those different units and their strengths and weaknesses as they operate within their regional context. And that is the main perspective of this measurement methodology. And what we really want to get at, we want to get away from the dyadic analysis and focusing on a particular country and analyzing it, but have a standard measurement of all units so that we can see which ones are more or less fragile in a particular region, so that we can look at why the regional system doesn't operate effectively. And if the regional system operates effectively, it should correct those differences in strengths and weaknesses amongst its constituent states. It should be able to diffuse or share information, knowledge, and productive activity.
Remember, the matrix is one part of a report, and the other part of the report are those curves that Monty showed you about regional performance. And unlike a lot of other ranking systems where someone has to be on the top and someone has to be on the bottom, most of the indicators, not all of them, but most of the indicators are absolute rather than positional. So if there really is convergence in lower discrimination, broader diffusion of income, lower infant mortality, better political stability, there is room for convergence of countries so that the differences can be reduced over time, and that's something to watch for.
All right. Did you answer the military question? Did I miss that? The military role?
From a system perspective, what's the role of the military?
Sure, maybe I didn't listen carefully, but the gentleman with the brown shirt had asked about the role of the military before we go on, and you postponed it.
As
you
far
can come
as
in later if you want.
Actual intervention into situations, I'm not a big fan.
Military in the countries, I think. Anyway.
But I have
actually
responded to the military in the country.
Was the question about national militaries intervening in politics or international military intervention?
That's like from a global perspective. In global governance, you see a role for the military.
Yeah. I think that there's a serious debate now about the degree to which national sovereignty needs to be disrespected in terms of interventions to prevent genocide or violence. This is obvious with regard to Sudan now, where there's a question about how much should Sudan be allowed to obstruct the activity of United Nations or African Union forces in bringing stability. This is an unsettled area. To the extent that international policing reduces the degree of discriminatory violence and repression, it would reduce the fragility of states in our matrix. But that's something that I think is still being debated. The UN is being stretched to the maximum now, and so unless there are increases in global capacity for that type of intervention, it's pretty much gone as far as it will go.
All right, a new set. Whoops, we lost her.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's essentially the same question, but rather than at the United Nations level, at the U.S. level, using this type of analysis and system. In the late 60s, the civil rights riots in the United States, they were responded to not only by the U.S. military, but also paramilitary. And I remember at the time someone came from Japan to study just how the U.S. paramilitary worked with the military in handling civil disobedience and these riots. Can you relate that in the context of what we're discussing?
Okay, let's collect a few. There were several hands up earlier. Jason, and then Lawrence, and then the lady in the back.
Jason Calder with Future Generations. My question is basically, what are you going to do now with this? Sort of looking forward now that you've put this together. Do you have particular predictive sort of objectives in looking over the next decade or so, how well this has predicted state failure or conflict? Do you have plans to compare this indicator to others? And that might be something very interesting, a competition of some sort, if you will. See how you all perform over time. And then just generally, how do you test the validity of an index like this? Can you go backward 10 years, let's say, collect the same data, and see what it tells you about the ranking and some suggestion about how well it quote-unquote works, or what's your definition of works? So just that general area of questions, I'd be curious to how you move forward with this.
Thanks. Lawrence Wucher, U.S. Institute of Peace. I was also going to ask about whether you've compared these results with, let's say, the failed states index. But also wondering about the time lag of the data that's available for use in the index. It seemed that on a number of cases, the latest data you were able to use was from 2004, 2005. How much of a problem does that cause? Does this make this more of a lagging indicator, more so than a leading indicator? Thanks.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. One more, and then we'll stop for the moment.
Hi, I'm Nina Serafina with the Congressional Research Service. How would one look at this matrix if one wanted to determine sort of where U.S. money should be put based on a sort of priority ranking according to threat coming from those countries to the United States, since most things as far as the allocation of resource now go not necessarily to humanitarian affairs, but looked more at from the sort of the global war on terrorism threat, if I can use that term.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Should we go back? Should we start answering?
Yeah, please.
Okay. As far as police in the U.S., the civil rights, the U.S. One of the nice things about this scale is the U.S. doesn't come out perfect. Right? I mean, the U.S. is not a straight zero. U.S. has got a fragility. It's low, about 2 out of 24, but it's not 0 because there are problems. And in the 60s, we have not done this whole scale, but when we've looked at violence, the U.S. civil rights riots were a case of major violence in the United States. Now, the use of paramilitaries, you mean tax squads and kind of heavily armed police, that was an innovation that suppressed, but there was also an awful lot of work put into reducing discrimination in housing and jobs and improving income distribution. It's not all done yet, but still, for a while, the 70s and 80s, things got better in terms of income distribution breadth. They've gotten a little worse again in the 90s. People argue about it. But there were a variety of measures that would have showed a change from more violent and more discriminatory conditions in the 60s to clearly less formal discrimination against minorities and less violence after. In terms of where do you go with this in terms of interventions, Nina, the two countries at the top of the scale are Democratic Republic of Congo and Afghanistan. We're not particularly worried about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, frankly. It is not a source of threat to the U.S. To the extent that it's a source of violence. It's a job for the UN, the African Union. Afghanistan we do see as a threat because of the particular relationship we have, the past we have with the Taliban and such. So what this says, if you're going to stabilize Afghanistan, if you're concerned about Afghanistan for strategic reasons, and you want to bring a greater degree of political and economic stability to Afghanistan, what do? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't help you prioritize because there are problems everywhere. Okay? But it does, at the least, suggest that you can't neglect. You cannot fix the problems of Afghanistan just with security. But at the same time, you cannot fix them just with economic reconstruction aid. So it suggests that if you're going to fix Afghanistan, you probably aren't going to be able to fix a lot of other places at the same time. So to the extent that the scale shows the degree of problems in multiple areas, it's a tool for planning and it's a tool for assessment. But it is not always a tool for prioritizing because threat assessment is a different procedure. There are other factors that come into that. Monty?
Well, one of the things I wanted to address was Chip's question now that he's gone. We chose the factors that we chose. Obviously, the first priority was to choose factors that we know measure a high element of risk. But there are also, the reason why the Fragility Index project went on for 4 years is we kept getting the same criticism. Well, you've chosen indicators here that move very slowly. There's no real opportunity for policy intervention. What good are they? It's nice to know that you can measure these things, but we can't change them. So, what it seems to us is that you're locking us into a situation where we just have to accept really bad outcomes. And so these indicators do actually change, and they can change fairly quickly. And we've charted, well, one of the indicators, discrimination. Discrimination has dropped in most regions of the world. It's not great, but it does move, and it is a policy decision that changes the nature of the discrimination. And of course, remedial policies help remove the residual quality of the discrimination over time. So most of these factors can be improved, some of them very quickly, some of them incrementally over time, but all of them are amenable to policy intervention. The nature of the threat, I think that's something that we never deal with. Every actor determines the nature of the threats that they're most concerned about, and they prioritize their own threats. Obviously, if they responded to measures like this, they'd be intervening in a lot more situations than they actually are. So the U.S. government is not likely to intervene in the situations where we would like them to. Mainly because they have a certain conceptualization of what is a threat and what is an interest, and they have to coincide. Another question was this a good risk model? It's not a risk model at all. We learn from risk models, but it doesn't predict anything. It isn't set up that way. It's set up to measure strengths and weaknesses. To give policymakers an indication of what their prospects are of going into a country and what they're likely to, what kind of resistance or incapacity they're likely to meet once they get there. We have developed these kinds of measures to act in conjunction with risk models, and we spend most of our time developing risk models. So if you want a risk model, we can come in here and talk about our risk models and look at the exact factors for every country that indicate whether or not they have a high risk of a certain type of instability outcome. This is merely for the other side. Assuming that risks are diminishing, what are their prospects for cleanup afterwards? And this is really a cleanup matrix rather than dealing with threats and risks.
I think that's right. When you say is it a lag or lead indicator, it's designed mainly as a lag indicator to say, as of the latest data, how is a country doing overall with regard to its political and economic development, with regard to both distributional and overall performance. Now, is it a lead indicator of anything? That is, you ask, what are we going to do next? We are going to do some investigations using different baselines to see whether changes in this indicator tell you anything about economic growth or political development in the future. That, in other words, we're going to say, how stable is it directionally? can countries move, can they recover quickly if they're in a downturn, and so on. But the main design of this was precisely to be how successful has a country been in meeting the broad range of economic and political development goals, and how can we identify those areas where it's not been successful that development and other intervening agencies might target.
Okay, I think we'll probably conclude on that. Not all your questions may have been quite addressed, but if you'd like to come up and ask follow-up, please feel free to do that.
And again,